You're listening to the Recovered Life Show.
Kristina, I got to tell you, you found this. You texted me this weekend. I was out of town at a little family event for like these little one-day things with my daughter, little sports thing. And you text me this and you're like, oh my gosh, the
came
US
from the Army.
Tell me about this. I was shocking.
Well, I always check, what's out there using the word codependency. And this article came up and it blew my mind and this is a recent article, and it talked about how prevalent codependency is, and in the Army, they have a chaplain that does the counseling and helps families, and they have their own unique situation, right? If they're moving around. And the chaplain discussed how prevalent codependency is when it comes to their counseling. In fact, he said, it shocks me that the person who, I still love him, even if they're being abused and it's not a good situation. And the fact that Army talks about it, we generally, a lot of times out there, people kind of tend to genderize codependency and say that it falls in the women's lap or the female partner, that it tends to look like a woman who's needy and she's helping her alcoholic or her partner, whatever that might be. But one of the statistics that came up about a study says that the American population demonstrates codependency by 90%. Can you believe that? And I think the fact that the Army felt it was important enough to put this on their website made me just happy, because when I'm doing my work, I also work with men, and it is definitely not a gendered issue. Plenty of men also deal with codependency, and they go in to explain it. And what I love about it is it's kind of bringing recovery into the mainstream. They talk about Melody Beattie's definition, and they talk about the book Codependent No More. And they talk about low-level codependency behavior. And it means, a spouse who alters their behavior to support the dysfunction of an alcoholic husband or wife in the hope of saving them, which is high-level codependency. And what I loved is that they admitted low-level codependency almost certainly exceeds a prevalence of 90%.
Wow.
While high-level is about 50%. So I wanted to share that because I want anybody to know that if you have that going on in your life, let's say 90% of you do, that it's important to talk about it and get some recovery.
Well, I just brought, just real quick, Kristina, I brought this up on the screen so people could see it. And, I want to comment on something that you said here. One of the things that is interesting about this article is, one, that the U.S. Army is doing it.
Yes.
But after thinking about this a little bit and having so many conversations with, alcoholics and people in recovery about codependency, the more I read this, the less shocking it became. And I'm going to tell you why. I think actually, I bet you, and it doesn't say this here. I didn't see this here. Maybe it did.
Okay.
I think that people that are in the U.S. Army probably suffer at a higher rate,
really,
of codependency, and I'll tell you why. Because I've known a lot of people that that served, and many of the people that I went to high school with served, and many of them in the Army, and I found those people to be much more the protector type. Right. They really felt a sense of obligation to protect. Right. And I think that that's a wonderful, beautiful thing. And I applaud anybody who's listening to this that's a veteran or in the armed services. Thank you for protecting us. But I will tell you from a psychoanalysis point of view, right? From a non-psychologist, to say it, the opinion is that sometimes I find this in codependency hidden with men is a sense that they have to protect everything and everyone.
Absolutely.
Even if they're unhappy and even if it's bad, if people are acting out, they feel they have to protect it.
Well, they adjust their behavior, which is what we're talking about. I mean, they adjust their behavior. Perhaps they feel, like you said, even if they have feelings, that they're not allowed to share them because that will affect the other person so greatly and hurt the other person. And, we have a lot of depression in the Army. We have a lot of PTSD based on, depending on where they were. It is a system that is based on the patriarch mostly. And it doesn't allow for boundaries. Once somebody is steeped in this ability that you do what you're told to do and you show up like a good soldier, It doesn't leave a lot of room for discussing feelings or showing up a little scared or a little sad or a little less than. And when you look at imposter syndrome, you layer it on top of codependency, you've got a bunch of people running around not able to express themselves, not feeling understood, having to shove the feelings down. And you're right. I would imagine if you are a soldier, male or female, you have this persona that you're portraying, and everybody, every human on this planet has fear, has anger, has sadness, has concern. And the fact that they hide it in order to portray some kind of something that the other person may need, which is you're my white knight. I remember Brene Brown's Daring book, and she shares in that book that she was writing, autographing books, and a man came up to her and he said, "It's very interesting to me that all of your stories about women." And she said, "Well, yeah, I'm a woman and this is about women." And he says, "Okay, that's very convenient." And so she was like, okay, tell me more. And he went on to, and of course I'm paraphrasing, to say that he could never show up in his marriage or with his daughters, because that's who he was getting the book signed for, anything other than a white knight.
Yeah.
Anything other, they would not accept it. And that is one of the such a beautiful story, because it explains, it brings in toxic masculinity. I mean, you talk about a group of people that are feeling the pressure of toxic masculinity. I can't think of another group than the Army that would have that much pressure on it.
Well, listen, I don't always agree with you on everything.
Okay, tell me.
This is one where I don't. Look, when you're in combat, you can't have a huddle to say, "Hey, Bob, hey, Sue, let's talk about our feelings."
No,
it's just not. It's not the place. And so, I sometimes think that the armed services get a bad rap with that. Because that's just, you can't do that. I mean, like, it'd be great if we could in a perfect world, but the reality is that feelings don't have to do a lot with the actual participating in warfare.
Sure.
Side of it. It's the application of what you've been trained to do, right? But I do agree with the fact that men are set up in a system to be the savior. And I do believe that everyone that I've known, I got to tell you, I don't know. I even know people who were in the Army, Kristina, who went on after and ended up in prison and all kinds of stuff. They still have service baked, right? Even when they were using, still, the whole, like, I have to serve or I have to be of service to people is baked in to the armed services. So, but this makes people unhappy sometimes.
Okay. Yeah. But I think that's more modern than we realized. In World War II, they sent people home. They diagnosed people with nostalgia, and they realized that these young men needed to go home for a month or two to get their heads straight. They needed it. I mean, it was literally a diagnosis. So it hasn't always been that it has to be continued, right? Continued, I'm going to show up and I have no feelings. I feel like the reason why the chaplain gets these numbers and talks about 90% is because they continue that belief system. They feel very strongly that they have to, even in their homes, without getting help.
To be clear, Kristina, I don't believe that people can't have feelings ever.
I know that.
In the Army. No, I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that I think sometimes people, they mix up what they're doing and the feelings and stuff. And look, not everybody who enters the Army comes from a healthy family background. And I think the most important thing about this, the most important thing about this article that I saw, that it made me think of you when I saw this article, because it says chaplains can remind counselees that people who practice codependency are almost always unhappy. And it says they expect that their enabling behavior will make the codependent person better.
Yes.
When they are enabled reinforces codependency. Right?
Yes.
They'll expect
that the ugly side.
That it will be repaid, and fail to recognize that dependence will not repay it. Right? Like, and this is the thing that whether you are in the armed services or not, that I loved about this article, because I never really heard codependency broken down in that transactional kind of way before.
And it speaks to the manipulation part, which we always get to in our work. Eventually, we start to figure out that we had these invisible contracts with these people where, and I'll speak to just my experience. I had an invisible contract with every romantic relationship that I had, which is I will turn myself inside out and love you to the point that you get better. And when they don't get better, I was mad as hell. I was so mad. Like, don't you see? I'm loving you to get better. You can't stay sick. And knowing that, we wouldn't do it, if somebody had a terminal illness, but depression, anxiety, alcoholism, these are all very serious ones that will lead to death. And those of us who are on the manipulative side, I'll be the first person to say I was a manipulator in my codependency. I never did anything because I wanted you I never did anything without the idea that you were going to repay it in some way, that you were going to be my project.
Look, we know, Kristina, that, it's been so interesting, like doing clubhouse rooms and things like that. We know when we talk with codependency is not passive, it's aggressive.
Yes.
Like, it's not. And this is the big, I think if people are listening to this and go, why are people in a recovery show talking about codependency? Look, I've never met, like you said, I've never met an alcoholic who is not also a codependent in some way or another, right? Because there's always an enabler around or something. And when you start to get sober and you start to, after years go by, and you start to unwind your family dynamic and your relationships in your life, you start to realize it's like, wow, the practice of codependency is super aggressive.
Yes.
Because it's forcing people.
You're moving them around.
You're moving them around. I mean, do you find that? Like, is that an aha moment with people?
Yes. And it's the sneakiest thing, because like children of a codependent mother don't understand why they're angry with their mother, because she gave her life for them. They don't recognize that she gave her life for them so that they would be a certain way, and they didn't get the choice to be who they really are.
Yes.
It's so attached to victimhood and martyrdom, but it's also people that are, leaders. They're people that can't fail, for anyone, that can't make choices to put themselves ahead of somebody else, that leader that stays later and serves first. There's nothing wrong with that, unless you're doing it with resentment, with anger, and you're showing up dishonestly. And that is something that I hope people will start to see, that it isn't just the typical relationship of an alcoholic and a Al-Anoner or a codependent who's doing everything they can do to help that alcoholic get sober. That's how the term was created. It was created by AA to describe this, but it also includes leaders at work, who manipulate their employees, who are everything to their employees. Mm-hmm. Codependency was in every relationship I had. And often a codependent is an incredibly hard worker. So it's very, very tricky to understand. And when I work with several people, they will say, I don't understand why I resent this person so much. But when we get down to it, it's what that love, that coddling, that love bombing meant that they had to be. And so they resent it whenever it shows up again in their life.
Yeah. This happens over and over and over again.
Sure does.
We're talking about the Army, but the thing is about why work is so difficult with codependency is because work is already transactional.
Yes. And it's rewarded.
I'm doing this, I'm going to get this back. Right. But the thing is that people will take it like we did a great show about codependency and work.
Yes.
And what the comments on that show and why people love that show so much, that past episode, is that, people realize it's like, well, this relationship isn't transactional at all in the way that I thought it was.
Right.
I'm giving all this energy out. These people didn't even request me to do this.
Yes.
I'm trying to save this department and get this charity
help you
moving.
With your marriage. Yes.
Yeah, it's like, you know what? Like, it's like, this is inappropriate. Like, And it's the whole thing about setting boundaries that makes this so great, is that as you start to realize this, you can set boundaries. And one of the things it didn't say is how they actually are enacting this in the Army, right?
Right.
Which it'd be interesting to see how they're doing that.
I would totally love to understand how they're going about. I mean, they talk about boundaries. They talk about respecting other people's boundaries. They talk about the fact that most codependency begins in childhood. Well, all codependency begins in childhood, and how people learn to silence and bury their emotions. And the idea of being able to record your emotions and describing them to a chaplain with codependency, rediscover their feelings as well as a sense of self. So they do have a few little tips about moving forward, but they're not saying how the Army is going to do this. And with the issues that we have with soldiers and the PTSD and soldiers, committing suicide, it's something that they've got to get it. They've got to start digging deeper. It has to be more of the conversation that we have. When you are a codependent, it's really important to realize that what you're doing is actually not from love. It's from fear.
Yeah. Well, we need to, I think if anybody's listening to this and is in the Army and deals with this, or in any armed services and deals with this, we'd love to have you on the show.
Yes.
And I think that's something that we have to do, is we have to reach out, because there are so many veterans that are in there. And there's people, look, I know people who have gone into the armed services sober, and that's a whole other conversation. And they're being way more supportive than they used to. There didn't used to be, but there's now sometimes whole companies of people that are, multiple people are sober. And I know that that's also an experience. So I think there's so many good things going on here. And when I saw this, it actually made me feel good. I was like, you know what? Things are moving in a direction that are good. People are becoming aware of this, and it's going to stop a lot of pain.
It is. It is. And your company is going to run better. And one of the things that I do is I work with companies on how do you make room for your employees to deal with their trauma, how you treat them, what is the culture. I was a great employee because I was dying to be recognized. And I would put my bosses, my supervisors in this entire situation that it was a family dynamic, which is one of the things that we discussed in that episode.
Yes.
How much I would layer my experience on top of this person. And as much as that might sound unprofessional, your employees are showing up with it anyway. And it's getting in the way of production and happiness, and it's getting in the way of retention. And so it has to, each employer or the Army, whatever we're talking about, the business world has to make room for solution in this area.